In the frost-bitten ruins of a burned-down chapel on the edge of Everidge, Elias Granger found a battered young woman wrapped in a filthy blanket. And from that moment on, everything he thought he knew about his church, his town, and his God began to unravel. October 1907, Everidge, Colorado. The wind had changed. It came from the north that morning, sharp, biting, and full of something Elias Granger couldn't quite name. Not just cold, something heavier. He stood on his porch with a tin mug of weak coffee and stared across the frost-covered field. The horses in the paddock stood silent, steam rising from their nostrils. The wind whistled through the slats of the barn, rattling the rusted hinges like a warning. 12 years alone had made Elias attuned to changes most men wouldn't notice. His wife, Martha, had passed during the winter of '95. Consumption took her slow and quiet, like dusk creeping across a snowfield. Since then, he'd spoken to few and trusted fewer. Just the Lord, the land, and the rhythm of his chores. But today, something tugged at him. A prickling beneath the skin, a sense that the morning was holding its breath. He set the coffee down, laced up his boots, and pulled on his coat, thick wool hand-stitched by Martha years ago and patched more times than he could count. His Bible lay open on the table by the window, as always. That morning he'd read from Psalm 34. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." He hadn't known then how close that verse would come to flesh. Elias stepped into the yard, his boots crunching over the frost as he crossed to the paddock. The horses were restless, shifting their weight. One of them, Ash, the gray, kept tossing his head toward the north fence. Elias followed his gaze. The ruins stood just beyond that line. 5 years ago, the original chapel of Everidge had burned to the ground. The fire had started late one night. No cause ever found, but folks whispered about lightning or a forgotten lantern. The congregation had built a new church closer to town, cleaner, grander, with stained glass and polished pews. But Elias never went as often after that. Something about the new building felt too proud, too polished. The old ruins remained, just a blackened stone foundation, half choked by dry brush and creeping ivy. And now, from this distance, something else, a shape, a figure, still and strange, curled near the soot-darkened stones. He tightened his coat and started toward it. As he crossed the field, each step felt slower than the last. The wind bit at his cheeks. The frost hissed beneath his boots. And as he drew nearer, the shape resolved into a person, a woman, barely more than a girl, wrapped in a filthy wool blanket, her bare feet purple with cold, her limbs trembling. She wasn't moving much. Her body shuddered in uneven breaths. Her head lolled to one side. Elias knelt down slowly, speaking softly. "Miss, can you hear me?" No answer. He moved closer. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, dried blood near her mouth. Her hair, dark and tangled, clung to her cheeks like seaweed. Her hands were clenched around the blanket, as if it were armor. "I'm Elias Granger," he said. "This is my land. You're safe now." Still nothing. She let out a faint whimper, then fell silent. Elias reached forward. She flinched before he touched her, her eyes flashing open, wild and full of animal fear. For a moment he froze. Then he whispered, "I won't hurt you." "On my word as a man of faith." Something in his voice, or maybe in his eyes, calmed her just enough. She didn't speak, she didn't move, but she let him lift her. She weighed almost nothing. Elias cradled her carefully, turned back toward the house, and felt the wind shift again, cold and full of prophecy. The door creaked open as Elias nudged it with his boot, carrying the girl inside. The cold clung to her like a second skin, and even with the fire still glowing in the hearth from that morning, the room felt colder for her presence. He laid her gently on the old settee beside the fireplace, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her like it was stitched to her skin. She didn't release it, not for a moment. Not when he laid her down, not when he tucked another wool throw over her legs, not even when he moved to build the fire higher. The logs caught with a crack and hiss. Orange light filled the room, dancing across the dusty floorboards and casting her bruised face in flickering shadow. She lay still, eyes open now, but unfocused, fixed on something far away. Elias moved carefully, quiet, deliberate, like he might startle a deer if he stepped too hard. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. First things first. He went to the kitchen and ladled some of last night's rabbit stew into a tin pot, setting it over the stove. It took longer than usual to warm. His hands were slower, clumsier. He kept glancing back toward the parlor. She hadn't moved. When the stew was ready, he brought a bowl and a spoon to her side. He didn't sit too close. He placed the bowl on the side table, crouched beside her, and offered the spoon. "You should eat," he said gently. "It's not much, but it'll help." She looked at him then, really looked. Her eyes, a deep brown, were sunken, bloodshot, and full of something he hadn't seen in a long time. Not just fear, something older, worn, like the part of her that used to be young had burned away long before this morning. Still, she took the spoon. Her hand trembled so violently it clinked against the bowl. She managed one small sip before setting it down and turning away again. "That's all right," Elias murmured. "Take your time." He rose, walked back to the kitchen to give her space. But even there, he could feel her presence in the house like a weight added to the floorboards. Not a burden, just something heavy. Sacred, in a way he didn't yet understand. When he returned a few minutes later, the stew remained untouched. She hadn't shifted. The blanket hadn't loosened. He reached gently toward her shoulder. "Miss, can I offer you something clean to wear? Something warm?" She flinched. Not violently, but enough. "I won't look," he added quickly. "You can change in the other room if you like, or not. Whatever you need." No reply. Her eyes remained fixed on the flames. Her grip on the blanket tightened again, white-knuckled. She didn't just need the fabric. She needed what it represented. Safety, control, the last defense between her and whatever had happened. Elias pulled his hand back and sat across from her, the fire between them. The room was quiet, save for the occasional snap of a log splitting. He opened his Bible, not to read aloud, just to hold it, to keep himself grounded, to remind himself who he was and what he believed. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147:3. He looked up. Her gaze had drifted to the Bible in his hands. She didn't speak, but something passed across her face, flickering like the firelight. Not trust, not yet, but maybe something smaller, something quieter. Recognition. Time passed. The sky outside turned from steel to dusk. Elias brought her water. She drank it in small sips, then returned to stillness. He offered her bread, softened in milk, but she declined with a slow shake of her head. As the lamplight grew dim, Elias took the worn rocker near the fireplace, sat down, and simply stayed. He didn't pray aloud, he didn't question, he just kept vigil. When he finally stood to retire, he paused at the doorway. "You're safe here," he said again, quieter this time. "No one will hurt you, not while you're under my roof." She didn't answer, but her eyes followed him, and that, Elias thought, was something. Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. The first night, Elias didn't sleep. He stayed in the rocker by the fire, dozing in and out, his Bible resting in his lap, his eyes flicking to the figure on the couch every time the fire popped. The girl, still nameless, hadn't moved much since he carried her in. Now and then her legs twitched beneath the layers of blankets. Once, around midnight, she let out a sharp breath that turned into a whisper. He leaned in, but it wasn't a word, just a sound, something caught between a sigh and a sob. Elias sat back slowly, guilt rising in his chest for listening so closely, as if pain were a secret to be stolen. At dawn, he brought her fresh water and left a folded towel and dress, his late wife Martha's. The fabric had long faded, but it was clean and soft. He didn't say anything, just placed it on a chair within view and returned to the porch, letting the wind wake him fully. That day passed in a hush. The wind didn't let up. The house groaned with it. The trees thrashed like something being punished. Elias spent most of the afternoon fixing a loose shutter and repairing the stove's chimney pipe, anything to keep his hands busy. Each time he checked in, the girl was exactly where he left her. He tried not to see Martha in her, tried not to remember the days of silence before the end. The stillness of grief looked so much like survival. But grief didn't come with bruises. Grief didn't make a girl flinch at a shadow. That evening, the first words came, not from her lips, but her sleep. Elias had just banked the fire and turned to grab his book when her voice rasped through the room. "No, not again." He froze. "I said no, please, God, not again." Then silence. She didn't wake, she didn't move, but her fingers, still wrapped in the wool blanket, clenched tighter, knuckles pale. Elias knelt slowly beside the couch, not close, just enough to see her face. Sweat dotted her brow. Her jaw trembled. He didn't wake her. Instead, he bowed his head, eyes closed, and whispered the words he didn't know she'd one day remember. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted." She slept again, fitful, still haunted. The second night, Elias left a candle burning beside her. It flickered gently against the stone hearth, casting shifting shapes on the walls. He didn't know if it helped, but it felt like something a father might do. When he rose the next morning, his back aching from the chair, he found the towel folded neatly and the dress gone from the chair. She hadn't worn it, but she'd touched it. That afternoon, he left a comb, a basin of warm water, and a slice of apple pie he'd warmed in the stove. She didn't eat it. But when he returned hours later, the comb was gone. That night, she cried in her sleep again. This time, words clearer. They said I'd burn, that God wouldn't want me. And suddenly, Elias felt the floor tilt beneath him, not from shock, but recognition. He'd heard that language before, twisted scripture wielded like a knife. He sat in the dark long after the crying stopped, staring at the embers, his fingers tight around the worn leather spine of his Bible. The sky over Everidge deepened into violet as Elias lit the last lamp inside his home. The small cabin was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He glanced toward the hearth, where Anna remained in her cocoon of silence and wool. She hadn't spoken a word since he'd found her, and though her body was slowly mending, Elias could feel something inside her was still locked in darkness. That evening, as Elias stirred a pot of bean stew, a knock came at the door, sharp, deliberate. He set the ladle down and wiped his hands on his apron before opening it. "Evening, Elias," came a familiar voice. It was Pastor Hale. He stood in his travel-worn cloak, white hair damp from the evening dew, Bible tucked under one arm. Elias greeted him with a half-smile. "You're out late," he said. "Just finished visiting the Weltons. Their youngest is down with a cough. Thought I'd stop by as you missed Sunday's meeting," Pastor Hale replied, stepping inside with practiced familiarity. "I also heard from town that you might have taken someone in." Elias gave a short nod.
Found her behind the ruins, nearly dead from cold. As Pastor Hale stepped into the parlor and caught sight of Anna, her reaction was immediate. She recoiled, her body curling tighter into itself as if to disappear. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket like claws digging into earth, her face vanishing beneath the rough wool. "She's been through something awful," Elias said quickly, noticing the flicker in the pastor's brow. Pastor Hale approached slowly, voice laced with practiced gentleness. "Child, I'm Pastor Hale. No need to fear. This is a house of kindness. May I offer a prayer with you?" But Anna shook her head beneath the blanket. Her breathing changed, quicker, shallower, and Elias saw the unmistakable tremor of held-in sobs. "She's not ready for visitors," Elias said, stepping in.
Pastor Hale hesitated, eyes lingering on the form beneath the blanket. "Of course," he said finally. "Pain takes time. We must meet it with grace." He turned toward Elias and lowered his voice. "I know brokenness when I see it, Elias. If she wishes to speak to someone of the cloth—" "I'll let her know," Elias said, firmer than he intended. There was a moment of quiet tension before Pastor Hale gave a small nod, patted Elias on the shoulder, and made his exit. The door shut gently behind him, but the room felt like it still held his presence. Elias returned to the hearth. Anna hadn't moved. "You're safe here," he said gently, not expecting an answer. Minutes passed. Then, muffled beneath the blanket, came her voice, dry and bitter. "That's what they all say about themselves." Elias froze. Her words struck with a weight no preacher's sermon ever had. He waited, unsure what to say. "He's a good man, Anna, one of the best I know," he said, quietly, almost defensively. Silence. Then a whisper. "They always look like good men. That's how they do it." Elias felt something shift. A cold draft, not from the window, but from within. Something unspoken pushing at the door of his long-held beliefs. That night he didn't finish his stew. He sat in the quiet, watching the fire burn low, and glanced toward Anna more than once. The house, so long accustomed to solitude, now held more than just two breathing souls. It held the weight of something unseen, something old and buried, struggling to surface. Elias settled into his chair by the fire, the embers glowing faintly through the darkened room. Anna lay on the settee, wrapped tightly in her woolen cocoon. He kept his distance, heart pounding with a sense of dread and desperate hope alike. The house was silent, save for the soft hiss of the dying flame and her occasional restless breath. The air felt heavier tonight, as though the walls themselves were bracing for something new. Around midnight, Anna stirred again. Elias's head snapped up, every nerve alert. He listened. Words came. Soft, broken, barely audible whispers bleeding through the hush. "Copper door, locked tight. I didn't open." Then another pause, a stutter. "They smelled of smoke. He wore silver. La—" Her voice faded. Trembling fingers tightened their grip on the blanket. Despite his guilt, Elias leaned in until the scent of old wool and cold sweat filled his senses. He whispered, "I'm listening." Anna didn't wake. She simply moaned, exhausted. In the still moment, Elias let those fragments replay in his mind. Copper door, locked tight, smell of smoke, silver, laughter. Enough to stir something. He rose and retrieved candle and pen, lit thin flame near the couch. He jotted the phrases on a scrap of paper. Copper door, locked tight, smoke, silver badge, laughter echoing. Those words lingered like ashes in the air. He sat back in his chair, scribbled a few lines more. Anna's waking fragments, possible locations, Mayor's cellar, Hale's study? Sheriff's office? The chapel basement? Every name, every place was a crack in the town's facade, but for now they remained guesses. The next morning, Elias found the scrap of paper gone from his desk. He blinked, his heart twisting. He hadn't taken it. She must have found it, glanced at it, taken it. That afternoon, he visited Everidge under the guise of errands, but in reality he was watching. He walked past the shuttered chapel foundation, paused at the feed store, glanced at the sheriff's office where a silver badge gleamed at the entrance. He noticed grand windows, polished oak desks, symbols of order and trust. He returned home before dusk, nerves taut. When he stepped inside, Anna was seated upright. The blanket lay loosely across her knees. She looked at him directly for the first time since arriving, eyes heavy yet lucid. "How long?" she asked quietly. He felt a pang. "What do you mean?" "Until I said their names in my sleep." Elias held his breath. "You heard?" She nodded. "That was me." He lowered himself beside her, carefully. "I heard and wrote." Then he added, "I think you're brave." She didn't smile. She simply slid her gaze toward the fireplace where the embers still shimmered. She said, "They wondered why I stayed. I couldn't prove anything, not in a town like this." Elias nodded slowly. "But I believe you." Silence fell again, heavier this time. After a few breaths, Anna stood, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, revealing bruises fading into yellow and blue. She moved stiffly, reaching for the water jug. She drank deeply, then turned back to him. "I'm trying to remember." That admission hung between them, promise and peril both. Elias felt the quiet gathering of purpose tonight, less pity, more resolve. The fragments from her sleep became stepping stones toward truth. And as Anna began piecing them together, Elias began envisioning his role not just as caretaker, but as witness, protector, and perhaps avenger. The next morning, Elias stepped outside before sunrise, the air sharp and still. He carried with him a small tin box and a handkerchief. He walked through frost-slit grass toward the chapel ruins, each breath trailing like a sigh in the chill. There was purpose now. Something pulled him beyond instinct or pity. At the foundation's edge, Elias knelt. Beneath an old stone foundation slab, he discovered an indentation. Hearts pounding, he pried it open. Inside was a weathered leather pouch, fastened by twine and dirk. He lifted it with trembling fingers and carried it back to the house carefully, as if cradling glass. Inside the pouch lay 3 items. A silver button, engraved faintly with the initials of Mayor Thornton. A small fragment of purple cloth, no larger than a thumb, with embroidery matching the lining of Pastor Hale's waistcoat. And, most important, a tiny journal, its pages brittle and stained with something dark. Elias laid the items on the table. The journal's cover was scuffed, the words almost erased by time and exposure. He brushed the surface gently, then opened to the first written page. The handwriting was small, precise, trembling at times. The first entry read, "I was forced into silence by their vows of power. When I spoke of leaving, they said I was a traitor. They threatened my job, told me words God would not approve. I kept the goddess cloth from Hale's coat, an act of desperation. May this witness." Elias's breath caught. He scanned further, noting dates, fractured sentences, references to rooms. Chapel ruins, back office under lock, meeting after sundown. He flipped pages until the final dated entry. "Tonight, they say I will be gone. I carry this truth in my hand and under this blanket. If I die, someone must read, someone must know. The devil wears Sunday clothes." Every word rang with finality. He closed the journal with a soft sigh and held it against his chest. He looked at the silver button, at the cloth, then back to the foundation outside. A foundation built on lies, now giving up the truth. Anna stirred from her seat near the fire. She looked at Elias with weary eyes, as though she'd known already, but the confirmation stung nonetheless. "He knew," she said softly, voice cracked. "Mayor Thornton laughed when I refused. Hale threatened me with scripture, said I'd dishonor God if I spoke." Elias nodded. "I found this." He placed the pouch on the table between them, cleared space in his palm. "It's proof." Tears welled in Anna's eyes, not of fear now, but something gentler. Relief. "You believed," she whispered. "I did." Elias's voice was steady, but inside something had changed. This was no longer about mercy. It was about justice. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the ridges of the roof like impatient fingers. Time was shifting. Elias folded the leather pouch, placed it inside the tin box, and tucked it beneath his jacket pocket. When Anna looked up, he gave her a slow nod. "We'll need to move carefully," he said quietly. "They hold power in that town. We must tread lightly, but hold firm." Anna reached out and touched his hand. Her grip was weak, but real. She hesitated, frightened. Elias swallowed. "So am I, but I won't let any more darkness hide in plain sight." A silence followed, one that felt different now, less empty, more resolved. That evening, Elias refused to eat dinner. Instead, he sat beside Anna with the tin box between them, their shoulders almost touching. He opened his Bible slowly, marking a verse, but did not read it aloud. Instead, he simply closed it. The fire burned low, and both sat in companionable stillness. The pieces were coming together, the fragments in her sleep, the journal in the ashes, the symbol-laden button and cloth. These were not just tokens, they were tools of truth. An unspoken agreement formed in that flickering glow. They would pursue the story, expose it, not for revenge, but so that a little girl's whispers would carry weight, and that faith, battered though it might be, would not be used as a shield by men who betrayed it. The wind died down at last. Only the hushed crackling of embers remained. Elias awoke that morning with a heaviness in his chest, a dull ache beyond grief, deeper than regret. The silver button, purple cloth, and battered journal lay in the tin box under his coat. They waited, silent witnesses. He sat at his table, coffee untouched, staring at a half-written letter. He'd meant to write authorities in Denver, but words had faltered. The size of betrayal and the men behind it made pen weighty. He felt like a child tattling on giants. Anna slept still, curled in her mound of blankets. Elias lingered, watching. She stirred once, murmured, and shifted, a subtle reminder that she carried the burden now resting in his hands. He recalled easier days in Everidge, church gatherings, Hale's sermons, the mayor's hearty handshake. All those moments now looked different, hollow. Announcing his doubt felt treacherous. His faith had always lived in the familiar rites and the familiar faces. To question them felt like tearing out the roots of his life. Still, something had shifted. The scraps from her dreams, the journal, the button, they weren't accusations. They were clarion calls. Truth, he knew, demands clarity. He stood and breathed deep. Cold air from the window pressed on him. If his faith could be shattered, it had to rebuild on rock. That afternoon, Elias walked into town under daylight's glare. He paused at the church's new front door. Pastor Hale's name glowed on a brass plaque. Elias's reflection shimmered in the beveled glass, older, wary, changed. Inside, a Sunday school teacher waved. Elias forced a polite nod, but no warmth. He stepped down the street past the mayor's office. Through a window he saw pews and hymnals. From another view, he glimpsed the sheriff at his desk, badge shining. Every face felt like a mask, every building a stage for unseen sins. Back at home, he found Anna seated at the kitchen table, the journal open before her. She traced faded lines, head bowed. "Did you share it?" he asked softly. She looked up, her eyes dark rings under exhausted lids. "No, not yet." He pulled a chair across from her. "This town hears loud voices, but they seldom hear quiet truth." She nodded. "I don't know if anyone will believe it." He pressed a page into her hand. "They must have someone who saw darkness and didn't turn away. That could be us." She closed the book. That evening, Elias knelt prayer, his voice tight. "God, I believed in your house built on these foundations. If you are there still, help me know where to go next." He didn't lift his eyes. He didn't finish the verse. Hours later, he rose and noticed the candle he'd lit earlier still flickering. No breeze stirred. Silence hung heavy. He closed his eyes, fingers lingering on the leather-bound journal. He realized, faith isn't always a flame burning steadily in church pews. Sometimes it's the ember left glowing after everything else has turned cold. He rose to his feet, steadier. He turned to Anna, the journal now safe between them. "I don't know what God looks like in all this," he admitted, "but I know you brought something sacred through hell, and I'm not letting that go unspoken." Anna's eyes shimmered in the lamplight. They sat together, quiet, but no longer alone. Anna sat by the hearth, journal open, candle flickering beside her. She drew a ragged breath and looked up at Elias, eyes unreadable. "I'm ready to tell," she said, voice low but steady. Elias sat beside her, careful to give space, but prepared to catch everything. For the next hour, Anna spoke in fragments. She began with her arrival in Everidge as the new schoolteacher, how she was welcomed, complimented, offered lodging with Mrs. Welch, how Pastor Hale had guided her, praising her zeal, how Mayor Thornton shook her hand and told her she was doing God's work. Then came the nights in the chapel basement. The study extension Hale showed her was locked behind a copper door. She described dim light, false kindness, and sharp commands. She stopped at details: silver cufflinks on the mayor's coat, the sheriff's badge cold against her skin, secret meetings with laughter echoing through the foundation walls. Elias gripped her hand. She kept talking, pressing forward through tears and trembles in her voice. She said they took turns threading threats with Scripture, telling her she'd burn eternal fire for slandering God's house, that she had nothing, no proof, and that she was alone. As she concluded, she spoke the hardest words. "I crawled out bleeding and broken. I thought dying might be kinder. But I wrapped myself in this blanket and I walked 12 miles through the cold because I couldn't carry their lies too." Silence followed. Anna looked at Elias. "I believed in men like him," she said, gesturing toward Hale. "I thought God spoke through them. Now, I see I was wrong." Elias felt his heart tighten, not for her, but for himself. For every time he'd stood beside Hale in prayer, for every handshake with the mayor. He stood, walked to the window. The moonlight glazed the ruined chapel just beyond his field. He whispered, "We have to do something." Anna nodded, though her lips were pale and quivering. He opened the tin box and placed the journal and trinkets in front of her. He'd made copies of the journal pages, hiding his handwriting. He'd even begun penning letters to newspapers outside Colorado, where men's faces wouldn't be recognized. Anna touched the cover of her journal, tears sliding slowly down her face. "We'll send it," Elias said softly, "to federal officials, to press beyond this place. We'll do it quietly, but we'll do it." She nodded again. "But what about this town?
What about faith? He knelt beside her, taking both her hands. Faith is still real, he said, but not in the church that hid evil. Our faith is now in truth and in each other. They sat together until the embers died, candle burned low. No cheers, no promises of justice. Only a pact. The truth would live, even if they were silenced. Over the next days, Elias buried the original blanket and journal under the apple tree behind the barn. He hid the tin box in his walls, behind the barn's timber skeleton. Every night, he and Anna refined the letters. Careful, factual, impossible to ignore. The mayor's elections loomed. Elias knew accusations could endanger them both. A wrong turn, an alarm bell, and their words might be crushed. But he also felt the shift. He saw people whispering in town, rumors of something dark in old Hale's sermons, of a teacher who vanished unannounced. He didn't chase gossip. He guarded truth. One morning, Anna left quietly before dawn, dressed in new but plain clothes. A horse-drawn coach waited at the Everidge edge. She looked back once at Elias, eyes bright. "I'll write," she promised. Elias nodded, choked. "Be safe." And then she was gone. In the empty room, Elias stood tall but fragile, holding the tin box close. In time, letters found their mark. Across Colorado, to Cheyenne, even Denver papers printed the account. Investigators asked questions. The mayor lost his re-election. Pastor Hale's sermons lost warmth. Sheriff's office traffic slowed. Anna found a small sewing shop in a town far away. He never left. Elias never returned to church either, not in Everidge. But each dawn he walked to the chapel ruins, knelt in the rubble and prayed softly, not for vengeance, but for healing. He had carried a truth heavier than grief, and in doing so, he discovered a faith more enduring than any creed, a promise that sometimes the quietest witnesses bear the fiercest light. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The howl of the wind outside mingled with Anna's fevered cries, sharp, ragged, terrifyingly close. Elias hovered at her side, heart pounding like a drum in a silent church. She was burning now, her breath shallow, each exhale a whisper of pain. He looked at her pale face and knew. He had reached the point of no return. Anna shifted beneath the blanket, skin glistening with sweat. She stirred, opened one swollen eye, and looked at him with a glimmer of fear and plea. Elias swallowed. Tears caught in his throat. He had promised not to look, but not if her life depended on destruction or salvation. With trembling fingers, he reached beneath the layer of wool. The blood-soaked blanket slid aside. What he saw made all hesitation vanish. Her back was a map of horror. Pale scars turning yellow, angry red burns, deep lacerations across shoulders that weren't caused by falls or accidents. These were deliberate. Patterns cut into skin, traces of restraint in bruises forming arcs, tiny circles scorched by heat. The blanket clung to wounds too fresh to be hidden. Elias drew back, but then forced himself closer. He closed his eyes, swallowed hard, and began examining methodically. Under left arm, a crescent bruise. Near the spine, lines that matched marriage lines on crepe-back cloth. Near the waist, a singed mark shaped like a badge. His mind raced. This wasn't random cruelty. Someone had designed the wounds, brand-marked her body with intent. He straightened, eyes locked on Anna's still face. She coughed weakly. Elias pressed a cool cloth to her brow and whispered, "Stay with me." He held her gently, mouth dry. His world shifted. Everything believed now unspeakably fragile. In that moment he understood. He could no longer wait. He rose, determined. This was the threshold. He had to act.
The quiet kindness of earlier would not suffice. He knelt, gathered the blanket, looked at the scars again as if memorizing, then carefully folded it. He carried her small bundle to the table and spread the blanket on a clean surface. He stood over it, mind clear as a winter dawn. This was not charity anymore. It was war. Elias picked up the journal, the tattered cloth and silver pieces from the tin box. He arranged them side by side, the blanket, the button, the cloth, the journal. A tableau of truth. He locked eyes with Anna. Her stare was exhausted but fierce. "I won't let this be hidden," Elias said quietly, voice steady. "Not on my watch." Anna nodded faintly. That single movement confirmed something he felt deep in his soul. She believed him. And that cemented his path. No more turning back. As Anna's breathing steadied slightly, Elias began copying the journal. Every date, name, detail. He snapped a silver button record. He folded the blanket like evidence. Every action precise, deliberate. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like a herald. This was the turning point. The moment where Elias crossed over, from man of solitude to man of action. And once he stepped beyond this line, nothing in Everidge would ever be the same again. Elias arranged the artifacts on his table under dim lamplight. The woolen blanket unveiled wounds too deliberate to ignore. Beside it, the silver button bore the mayor's insignia. The violet thread fragment matched Pastor Hale's coat lining. And between them lay the journal, cracked leather, yellowed pages stained by sorrow. For a moment, Elias simply looked. Each piece was silent, but spoke louder than words ever could. He opened the journal to its final entry. A careful hand had spelled names, dates, threats. He traced each line with his fingertip. Pastor Hale, Mayor Thornton, Sheriff Wyatt. Their actions inscribed in heartbreak. Each flip of a page brought a new assault. Broken promises, midnight threats, forced silences. One entry admitted, "I kept their threats under my breath. I wrapped myself in hope and shame." He swallowed. This was proof. He held the button up to candlelight. The tiny engraving glinted, an emblem of power now tarnished by blood. The cloth felt soft under his fingers, but he knew its wearer used comfort as a weapon. Elias closed the journal and looked at Anna. She sat upright, feverish but lucid. Her gaze on the relics mirrored his own, disbelief, grief, and steel. "This is it," he said, "unquestionable." He tapped the button. "No denial can erase this." Anna's lip trembled. She nodded faintly. Elias laid a steady hand across hers. A moment later, a knock echoed in the house. Elias stiffened, his pulse jumped. The front door opened slowly. Pastor Hale. He stepped in as though he belonged, gaze scanning the table. Elias stood firm. "What are you doing, Elias?" the pastor asked, voice calm. Elias didn't hesitate. "I'm putting your evidence here, exposed under lamp and witness." He gestured to the relics. Hale's face tightened. A shadow flickered in his eyes. "You unwrapped a blanket?" he said coldly. "I did." Elias opened the journal to the entry dated 3 weeks ago. "I'm reading her words. Every entry names you." Silence swallowed the room. Hale took a step back, blinking. Elias could hear his breath. "You brought her in," Hale said slowly. "You must know how scandalous." "One girl's truth isn't scandalous," Elias replied softly. "The scandal would have stayed buried forever without these words."
He didn't just wear faith. He wielded it to shield what he did.
Hale's jaw went slack. He shifted, then turned and walked out without a word. The door closed behind him with finality. Elias exhaled. He closed the journal reverently and folded it in clean linen.
He placed the button and cloth inside, sealing them in a small tin. Anna leaned against him, weak but unwavering. They'd reached the climax. Elias had exposed what couldn't be erased. The turning point was complete. Outside, wind rattled again, more gently this time, as though the storm had passed. In the hush that followed, Elias and Anna sat together, surrounded by the evidence of truth, ready to move forward, knowing there was no turning back. Silence hung over the room like a thick fog after Pastor Hale's abrupt departure. Elias sat in the stillness, rubbing his fingers over the edge of the journal. The candlelight trembled, as if uncertain whether to continue. Anna leaned heavily against the table, eyes fixed on the relics. Elias could see the war inside her. Relief, fear, sorrow, all etched into her bruised body.
He swallowed hard and turned his gaze toward the ruined chapel visible through the window. A shell of belief, burned to ashes. He carried his Bible to the table and opened it slowly, almost reluctantly. His finger found a verse he hadn't read in years. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. His voice broke as he read the line aloud. No sermon had ever felt more real than this one moment in a humble cabin, with a broken young woman leaning on him and justice lying silent on the table. Anna looked up, tears running down her cheeks. "That verse, it's for me." Elias nodded. "And for you," he said quietly, "and for anyone who was silenced." He closed the Bible. The words stayed in the air like a promise. They sat together in companionable sorrow, neither moving, both changed. He thought of Pastor Hale preaching about redemption, of the mayor extolling righteousness in town meetings, of Sheriff Wyatt speaking of law and order. Each word now felt hollow, echoing off walls built on lies. Elias placed a gentle hand on Anna's shoulder. She flinched at first, then settled. "I don't know what they'll do next," she whispered.
"Let them try," he replied. His voice was steady. "We hold the truth." Outside, the wind settled. But inside, Elias's world continued to shift. The foundation of his faith had cracked, and he felt fear. Not for himself, but for what had been lost. He stood and began to unseal the tin box containing the journal and relics. He faced the weight of his choice: preserve silence or wield truth. A distant knock dismissed that choice. Elias looked toward the door, then back at Anna. She nodded slightly. Permission. Elias rose and moved to the front door, opening it without a word. A federal marshal stood there, his hat low, eyes hard. The marshal carried copies of the letter Elias had sent, the anonymous report made months ago, now answered with authority. He said, voice low but clear, "I need to speak with you, and with the journalist who wrote this." He paused, then added, "We have orders to secure evidence." Elias felt something shift again, not fear, but acceptance. The point of no return wasn't just in revealing truth, but in watching it move beyond the two of them. He stepped back, motioning for Anna to remain inside and safe. The marshal came in, eyes flicking to the table, to the evidence. Elias stayed silent, letting the law do what he could not alone. Anna wiped her cheeks and stood behind Elias. And together, in the hush of dawn, they watched as the truth began its course, finally set free. Elias did not sleep. He remained beside the embers, candles sputtering low, evidence arrayed in careful order on the table. Not one tear, not one murmur. He sat in rigid silence, arms folded across his chest, vigil kept. Outside, the wind had eased to a low moan. Inside, every heartbeat felt loud. He could hear his pulse in his ears, the only sound in the void. He glanced at Anna, her breathing shallow, occasional shivers piercing the dark.
protective, resolute. He poured coffee into 2 small cups and handed one to her without saying a word. She accepted it with a nod. The silence wasn't empty. It created space where unspoken truths lay heavy. Elias held it with steady calm, refusing the urge to speak. Every so often, he stood to move a relic, turning the journal's pages, smoothing the blanket, brushing dust from the silver button. Each motion deliberate, caring. Evidence was not abstract. It was flesh. Dawn approached.
A pale glow pressed its shutters. Elias reached for his Bible, not to read, but to close it, leaf falling softly. It was gesture enough. Faith now rests in truth more than ritual. He turned and found Anna watching him, her eyes glistening in the early light. She offered no words, just a weak but certain look. They were 2 people bound by the same resolve. He stood, stepped outside to stretch frost-tensed limbs, turned and watched the ruins of the chapel beneath dawn's hush. The sight of her rescue now framed the truth he was unraveling. He returned inside and lifted Anna's hand. "It's time," he said, his voice steady but soft. No flourish, no hesitation. She nodded and took his arm. Together they carried the tin box containing all proof out through the kitchen and into the early morning. Each step measured, purposeful. At the door, Anna paused, looking back. Elias offered silent comfort. She stepped into the world again. He shut the door behind her and remained a moment alone. Sunlight filtered through the window, grazing the items left on the table. The journal, the cloth, the button, forgotten under the lamplight. They waited.
This was the moment of transition from hidden pain to open justice. Elias walked to the window and watched Anna's silhouette in the distance. The girl he rescued, now walking into her uncertain future. And in his heart, a fierce, silent promise. He would carry this vigil moment until justice was no longer whispering behind ruins, but spoken openly. No words needed. The vigil spoke louder. Elias moved slowly behind the barn, where the frost had not yet reached the ground. In his hands was a worn metal tin wrapped in canvas. Inside it, truth, fragile and flammable. The blanket, the silver badge, the journal, the violet thread. He knelt beneath the gnarled apple tree, now leafless and dry. It was here he dug a small pit, one spade at a time, until the cold earth gave way. He lowered the box into the ground with quiet reverence, like burying a body or something even heavier, a memory too sacred to be held above soil. Above that grave, he knelt and prayed, without words. Just breath, just silence. Then, back inside the cabin, Elias sat at the kitchen table, dipped a fresh pen into black ink, and began to write. He copied every line from Anna's journal, careful not to editorialize, only to preserve. Dates, names, phrases etched in anguish. Behind the pulpit, cold iron, forced silence. 3 letters were written, each addressed anonymously, sealed in plain envelopes sent to editors of major papers, Denver, Chicago, and Cheyenne. He added a note. These are not stories, these are testimonies. Publish them before others are buried. He watched the ink dry. He tied the bundles in brown paper, marked, to be opened immediately. No return address, only truth inside. Later that evening, he walked Anna to the porch. She wore a modest shawl, eyes steady despite the weight in her chest. The night was quiet, a strange, tender quiet, the kind that comes before things begin to change. She paused, looking back into the house. Elias didn't ask what she saw. He understood. She was seeing what was lost and what might still be saved. "Will they read it?" she asked. He nodded. "If they have eyes." "And if they don't?" "Then we write it again, and again if needed." He watched as she folded her hands across her lap. Elias placed the sealed letters into a canvas bag, then reached for his coat. "I'll ride to the post at dawn," he said. Anna offered no reply, only a soft exhale, like the final breath of fear leaving her body. That night, Elias didn't light the lamp. He sat beside the fireplace, the glow of embers painting the room in reddish gold. No words, just a heart that had chosen a side. And when morning came, snow began to fall. Light, barely there, but enough to cover where the tin had been buried. Truth sleeping in ashes, waiting to rise. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Elias never returned to the old chapel in Everidge, not in flesh, not in spirit. He waited only long enough to hear the echoes of the past fade into silence. Now, each Sunday, he and Anna gathered beneath tall pines behind his homestead. The branches stood sentry, the soil soft beneath a carpet of needles. They read scripture by a lantern placed on a gnarled tree stump, unadorned, simple, intimate. No stained glass, no hymnals, no voices stained with pride. Just two weary souls seeking quiet sanctuary in each other and in God's unfailing word. On one particular evening, as frost gathered at dawn, Elias turned to her and read a verse that had carried both them through darkest nights. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. He paused, the words hanging in cold air. Anna's breath caught, and she met his gaze with a fragile hope. "It wasn't in that church I found comfort," he said softly. "It was in believing something kind and keeping faith even when the world trembled." She nodded, tucking her blanket closer. Elias closed the Bible and let his hand rest over hers. In the weeks that followed, word of the letters and the buried journal reached farther than Everidge. Rumors grew into news. The mayor lost his seat. The sheriff was quietly reassigned. Pastor Hale faded from pulpit to whispers. Elias watched from afar. He did not gloat. He did not attend the new church services in town, where reformers tried to rebuild broken trust. He simply walked beneath those pines, each Sunday, reading scripture at that stump. Anna visited occasionally, riding in from the town where she still lived quietly. She brought letters, small gifts, a scarf, knitted socks, a loaf of fresh bread. Each gesture spoke of recovery. One fall afternoon, she arrived bearing a letter from Denver. Investigators had found more victims, more stories, some who still trembled at telling them. Her words, "We are not alone." Elias's heart swelled. He stood from the stump and offered her his arm. Together they walked between the pines. No sermons passed their lips, no hymns echoed through the branches. Only quiet companionship and the steady sound of two lives rebuilt. Their friendship became a quiet beacon. Other women came, those who had been silenced, gathering beneath the pines for reading and prayer. Not organized, not public, just healing in shared presence. Elias realized this was his calling, not a preacher in the church, but a keeper of light in broken places. The community whispered of him as the man who sees, the one who listened, who believed, who acted. One Sunday, a young mother asked why he never returned to the restored chapel. He smiled gently and said, "I found God somewhere quieter." And when asked what he carried with him above all else, Elias would simply say, "Faith in truth."
And in the quiet courage of broken people who refuse to be silenced. Snow had turned the world white and quiet, smoothing every trace of footfall and doubt. But beneath the hush of winter, life stirred. Elias rose before dawn one Sunday. Frost laced the windows. The pines behind the homestead held their breath in still green rows. He carried the tin box, now emptied of its journal and relics which had been handed over to investigators, into the soft hush and paused at the apple tree where he'd once buried truth. He uncovered the patch of ground, now settled and silent. The tin beneath was empty, as intended. Elias pressed a hand to the tree's trunk. Roots crease old soil, anchoring witness. He whispered to the silence, "Truth lives." Back inside, Anna sat by the hearth. Fresh bread and hot cider waited. She looked up, eyes bright with renewed kindness. The change in her was subtle, shoulders steadier, gaze less haunted. They shared the morning in companionable quiet, reading from an old psalm and allowing no need for explanations. In the afternoon, a small college president from Denver came calling.
She'd heard of Anna's surviving courage and came to establish a scholarship for young women educators. Anna accepted with modest pride, relief shading her smile. The scholarship fund was named the Whispering Willow, in honor of the wind beneath which they had found courage. Elias watched from the corner of the room. The pines outside, he thought, are like quiet sentinels judging the world by root, not bark. He had become one among many, still, unassuming, but steadfast. As the sun lowered, the community gathered, not at the chapel, but outside Elias's homestead, beneath the pines. Shyly, people emerged, families he had seen in church pews, neighbors who once nodded and averted their eyes when Anna passed. Many brought apples from the firm rows of the orchard, or pies they baked in hope. Some simply stood, silent witnesses themselves. No official ceremony, just quiet gathering and a shared loaf of bread. Elias stood among them, his hair flecked with gray. Anna took his hand gently at his side. A teacher from town spoke softly. "We owe you the truth, and this." Elias shook his head. "You owed it to yourselves. I just carried a burden until someone listened." He turned to Anna. She sat on a low stump, warmly clothed but fragile. He crouched beside her and knelt on one knee. No grand speech, just this. Faith is not in grand pulpits or polished floors. It lives in broken hearts mended by quiet courage. Keep that candle alive. They released paper lanterns into the dusky sky, soft orbs of light drifting above the pines. Each carried a prayer, a hope for healing, a promise that what was buried would not be forgotten. Night settled fully. The lanterns glowed like stars upturned. Elias stood alone beneath them long after the last silhouette had faded into homes lit with lamps. He closed his eyes and listened, not to absence, but to echoes of survival. In the days that followed, the story of Everidge became part of newspapers, academic newsletters, even a denominational magazine. Investigators confirmed multiple complaints. Officials quietly reprimanded the pastor. Mayor lost re-election. Sheriff transferred. No grand trial. Some claimed names avoided court, but truth had been unveiled. Anna left for Denver to work at a women's college, teaching literature and life. She wrote occasionally, careful yet brave, signing each letter, "Forever in awe of you who dared to believe." Elias stayed behind. Some asked why he didn't follow her. Others offered a church pulpit or teaching job, but he politely declined. He looked after winter. He repaired the orchard fences. He carved a bench beneath the pines. On Sunday mornings, he still went out to read scripture and gently set that lantern on the stump. No one joined, not in numbers, but peace multiplied nonetheless. Sometimes a child walked by, eyes curious. Elias would smile, pat the stump, and say, "If you ever feel lost, come here. I'll read with you." Eventually, a plaque appeared near the stump, "In memory of truths we dared to tell." Some called him the man who kept the flame.
Elias never said much about it, but when asked what mattered most, he always replied, "The light doesn't belong to the holder. We are simply its keepers." And maybe, in Elias's quiet strength, you remember someone. Your father's hands, your grandmother's Bible, a silence you once trusted. These aren't just tales. They're echoes of truth that shaped the true Wild West stories. If it moved your heart, share this light.
Let others remember what courage looks like in quiet places.